Thank you for listening to Depictions Media Radio. Welcome to Policy and Rights, the show about government policy and human rights. Welcome back to Policy and Rights here on Depictions Media Radio. I'm your host, Michael Clogs. In British Columbia, the coroner service sets a date for the inquest into the death of Zachary Wyeth. The coroner inquest into the death of Zachariah Andrew Brian Wyeth will begin at 9:30 a.m. on August 19th at the Nelson Law Courts on Ward Street in Nelson. The death of Wyeth, 28, was reported to the BC Coroner Service on February 16th, 2019, with the events involving the RCMP under Section 18-2 of the Coroner's Act. Inquests are mandatory for any deaths that occur while a person is detained or in the custody of a police officer. And in Courtenay, families benefit from two new child care centers, and the families in Courtenay will have access to child care spaces located at Arden and Glacier View Elementary Schools. Child care on the grounds has a real impact on families' lives. Mitzi Dean says, Minister of State for Child Care, by providing high-quality child care directly on school grounds, children receive the best start on their way to learning in a familiar, nurturing environment, while making it easy for busy parents to balance their professional and personal responsibilities. And that's what we have for British Columbia. There is a political move, or I say a political campaign, that in Surrey, BC, to keep the RCMP, and the statement was to remove or vote out the NDP. In October, there will be a provincial election, and the move could be a political move in order to get rid of the NDP, so that Surrey does not have to switch to the Surrey police force that is being pushed by the NDP. There are some other underlying things that could be there that the whole process of getting the Surrey police force into place could be too far along to actually stop by time the election comes. And some global updates. And as we know that we had a UN backing to a U.S. resolution for Gaza, and the Hamas has released a statement welcoming the UN Security Council resolution calling for a full and complete ceasefire in Gaza. The vote signals that international support for the three-part ceasefire plan outlined U.S. President Joe Biden on May 31st, which he has dubbed an Israeli proposal. The U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken, who has been in the Middle East to drum up support for the deal, called the Hamas statement a hopeful sign, but noted the group political leadership in Gaza has yet to formally respond to the proposal. Russia, which abstained but did not vote, uses veto power against the U.S. draft, remarked that Israel's official position on the deal remained unclear. The proposal has been agreed to by Israel's war cabinet, but has not been divulged to the wider government. So there's still some questions about the deal and the wider government, which we heard a little bit about that yesterday, and we also heard some of those Russian concerns in yesterday's episode about the deal as it was proposed. And in other news from CNN, the Hunter Biden trial, the jury in the Hunter Biden federal gun trial will resume deliberations, and the president's son on Monday declined to testify on his own defense, and both sides presented closing arguments in a historic case. The 12 members of the jury will soon decide whether Hunter Biden is guilty of 3 charges related to the purchase of a gun in 2018, which prosecutors said violated federal law because he was addicted to crack cocaine at the time. He pleaded not guilty to all charges. If convicted, Biden could face up to 25 years in prison and a fine of $750,000 through he will likely receive far less than the maximum, as he is a first-time offender. On gun-related incidents with the Bidens, President Joe Biden will address major gun prevention conference in Washington, D.C. today, nearly 2 years after he signed the first major bill for gun safety legislation in decades. The appearance as the White House and the Biden campaign have sought to promote the president's work to tackle gun violence, and it issued his team's believes resonate with key blocks to voters, including women, young people, and Latino communities. A CNN conducted a poll in April, and they found that 48% of the registered voters said gun policy will be extremely important to their next presidential vote in November. So, why don't we listen to, as the UN Security Council also voted yesterday on a policy naming things to be a war crime for sexual-based violence against women and civilians, where terrorists have used rape and sexual assault to terrorize people.
The 9,649th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. No. The provisional agenda for this meeting is threats to international peace and security caused by terrorist acts. The agenda is adopted. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. Members of the Council have before them document S/2024/442, the text of a draft resolution submitted by the United States of America. The Council is ready to proceed to the vote on the draft resolution before it. I shall put the draft resolution to the vote now. Will those in favor of the draft resolution contained in document S/2024/442 please raise their hand? The result of the voting.
Votes against and abstentions. Votes against.
Okay. Those against? Abstentions? The result of the voting is as follows: 14 votes in favor, 0 votes against, 1 abstentions. The draft resolution has been adopted as Resolution 2734. I now give the floor to those members of the Council who wish to make statements after the vote. I give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. The United States thanks Council members for their constructive engagement on this resolution. We welcome the extension of the 1267 Committee's monitoring team and ombudsperson mandates for an additional 36 months. We also welcome the Council's further recognition that sexual and gender-based violence is a tool terrorists utilize to further their aims, which is reflected in this text, including its listing criteria. The United States welcomes the support from Council members regarding this inclusion, given the devastating frequency of this horrific tactic. ISIS's use of sexual slavery against the Yazidi community to incentivize recruitment, Al-Shabaab's use of abduction, rape, and forced marriage to subjugate those in areas under its control, Boko Haram's kidnapping of schoolgirls to generate revenue. I could unfortunately go on and on. It is clear that terrorists use SGBV as a tactic to punish, humiliate, ethnically cleanse, fund their activities, and control territory. Promoting accountability for conflict-related sexual violence is a priority for the United States, and this resolution is a critical step forward for the global campaign to end sexual and gender-based violence. Extending the 1267 monitoring team also demonstrates the importance of its independent reporting. Recent 1267 monitoring team reports have shed light on the concerning growth of ISIS and Al-Qaeda branches and related operations across the African continent. Today's renewal also extends the mandate of the 1267 ombudsperson, who plays an important role in promoting fairness, transparency, and due process, particularly for non-state actors. Colleagues, the 1267 sanctions regime continues to play a critical role in promoting peace and stability around the globe. The United States again thanks Council members for their constructive and fruitful engagement to achieve the adoption of this important resolution. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United States for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of China.
President, China voted in favor of the just adopted Draft Resolution 2734. The resolution reiterates grave concerns about terrorist activities, asks the states to continue strict implementation of the sanctions measures, and renews the mandates of the monitoring team and ombudsperson of the 1267 for 36 months. It once again demonstrates the international community's firm resolve to combat terrorism. Resolution 2734 provides that when Daesh and Al-Qaeda use sexual and gender-based violence as a terrorist tactic, such acts may be eligible for designation on the basis of the current criteria. Before the international community reaches a clear consensus on the link between sexual and gender-based violence and terrorism, the phrasing in this resolution is more appropriate. We hope that the committee will strictly abide by the aforementioned provision in its follow-up work. President, at present, the situation on the international counterterrorism front remains grim. Terrorist organizations, including Daesh, Al-Qaeda, ETI, MTI, PTTP, and the Majid Brigade, continue to be active. The Council should continue to make good use of the 1267 sanctions regime and support countries' counterterrorism efforts. Council members should strengthen mutual trust and coordination, abandon ideological bias and double standards, and consider listing requests objectively and impartially. China thanks the monitoring team and ombudsperson for their work and expects them to continue to perform their duties impartially so as to maintain the authority and effectiveness of the 1267 sanctions regime. Thank you, President.
I thank the representative of China for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Russian Federation.
President, the Russian Federation abstained on Security Council resolution that extended the mandate of the sanctions monitoring team on sanctions against ISIL and Al-Qaeda, and also the ombudsperson on delisting for a period of 3 years. We have consistently supported existing sanctions regime 1267. We believe it's one of the most effective. The relevance and importance of the work of the Security Council Committee 1267, 1989, 2253 gives rise to no doubt, particularly bearing in mind the nature of the contemporary terrorist threats from ISIL, Al-Qaeda, and other associated groups in Syria, in Iraq, Afghanistan, Southeast Asia, and in Africa. The analysis of the challenges clearly demonstrates the importance of effective implementation of the relevant resolutions of the Security Council on this. We support the mandates of the monitoring team and the ombudsperson. The Russian Federation is not calling into question the heinous nature of any sexual crimes. There is no doubt that if terrorists associated with ISIL or Al-Qaeda use sexual violence as a method of achieving their goals, and that if there is proof of this, then the committee should take this information into account and act accordingly. At the same time, recently we are witnessing a situation whereby UN mechanism as a whole and subsidiary bodies of the Security Council also used to abuse the sanctions toolkit. In some cases, the opportunity to see proof and founded in propaganda-based statements taking place, and this is unacceptable and it undermines the UN's authority. We will stand up strongly to any attempt to use any politicized lever to water down the counter-terrorism nature of Committee of 1267, 1989, 2255 Committee, and we will continue to stand against any proposed change of priorities, where then rather in the place of real cooperation to fight ISIL, Al-Qaeda and associated terrorist groups, a distraction of the focus to secondary questions that have no added value directly in the context of countering the terrorist threat. It is unacceptable to automatically tie the question of SGBV to terrorism. We are strongly convinced that cases linked to sexual violence should be considered as long as there is reliable information, and also they cannot and should not be used as an independent criteria for listing. President, in conclusion, I'd like to underscore that in the work on the text, our delegation demonstrated a constructive outlook and a readiness to take a responsible approach to finding compromises. We provided all necessary arguments on all complicated and difficult questions. However, the American sponsors did not think it valuable to preserve the consensus spirit of the counter-terrorism agenda at the Security Council. The decision was not an easy one, but we did not want to block this resolution at the Security Council because we believe it is important to continue have the work of the monitoring team and ombudsperson to continue. In our work, we will continue to take a responsible approach to designating individuals' organizations on the sanctions list 1267, primarily due to the terrorist nature of their actions. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of France.
Je vous remercie, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, President. France welcomes the adoption of this resolution renewing the mandate of the Sanctions Monitoring Team on 1267 and the provisions on the Ombudsperson. We thank the United States for leading the negotiations. Daesh and Al-Qaeda terrorism is one of the main threats to international peace and security, and we will continue our shared fight against these terrorist groups. The resolution we have just adopted allows us to update the sanctions regime against Daesh and Al-Qaeda to better take into account the evolutions in this threat. It recalls us that we must continue with our mobilization, particularly to combat terrorist propaganda and to dry up the sources of financing for terrorist groups. France welcomes this. This resolution allows us above all to establish the fact that sexual and gender-based violence are, in some cases, parts of terrorist tactics. Let us remember that 10 years ago Daesh hit the Yazidis, particularly women and girls belonging to this community. Many of them were victims of sexual violence, including sexual exploitation, and were enslaved. These women continue to feel the consequences of the atrocities caused by Daesh, and France does not forget them. We continue to work so that these crimes will not go unpunished. We therefore welcome the adoption of this resolution, which opens the way to better recognition of this violence in the international fight against terrorism. These can now be taken into account in the context of requests for inclusion on the sanction lists. The monitoring team will have to include this in dialogues with member states and in its reports from now on. This is a further step to fight impunity for the perpetrators of sexual and gender-based violence. Be assured, President, of France's full commitment in combating terrorism. I thank you.
I thank the representative of France for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
Thank you, Mr. President. Algeria's vote in favor of this resolution reflects our conviction that it upholds the core objectives and legitimacy of Daesh and Al-Qaeda 1267 sanction regime. We also believe that it responds to the evolving terrorist threat, considering the gravity of this threat and our unwavering commitment to international cooperation in countering terrorism. We regret that this resolution was not adopted by consensus. The 1267 sanctions regime has always derived its strength and effectiveness from the unity and political commitment of all Council members. Algeria appreciates the efforts of the penholders to address the concern of our delegation. However, we are still of the view that some matters deserve further consideration, including in the relevant UN bodies. Moreover, we underscore the importance of the member state-driven nature of the listing and delisting process and of preserving the character of these processes. We firmly believe that the mandate of the monitoring team should not be politicized, as doing so would undermine the credibility and the effectiveness of the whole sanctions regime. In addition, reviewing the mandates of the ombudsperson and the monitoring team for an extended period will provide greater continuity and resilience for the implementation of the sanctions regime. We also support efforts to further strengthen the independence and capacity of the ombudsperson in line with due process. To conclude, Mr. President, Algeria will continue to work constructively with all delegations to preserve the integrity and effectiveness of the 1267 sanctions regime. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Algeria for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Sierra Leone.
Mr. President, Sierra Leone welcomes the adoption of the resolution, which reaffirms the United Nations commitment to fight against terrorism and terrorist acts, especially those committed by Daesh, Al-Qaeda, and their affiliates. We voted in support of the resolution to renew the 1267 sanction regime mandate because of our firm belief that it has been an effective mechanism in combating global terrorism and fighting against Daesh despite ongoing challenges. We believe the adoption of this resolution further strengthens the need for ongoing vigilance in monitoring terrorist groups and encourages international cooperation to support anti-terrorism efforts. In voting for this resolution, we believe that high-risk jurisdictions need to comply with international standards for combating the financing of terrorism, CFT, and anti-money laundering, AML, as established by the Financial Action Task Force, FATF. We also recognize the efforts of CTED and CTC to involve the Financial Action Task Force and other global financial regulatory bodies in this process. Similarly, we welcome the inclusion of sexual gender-based violence as a designated listing criterion. We believe this is a positive step in the right direction, and we further anticipate its full implementation. Additionally, its inclusion as a designated criterion will help increase accountability for SGBV linked to terrorism. We appreciate this Council's continued commitment to preventing terrorist acts and promoting peace and prosperity through collaboration and dialogue with host and neighboring countries in the fight against global terrorism. In closing, We congratulate United States of America in its capacity as pen holder for steering these negotiations in an inclusive manner and for considering all council members' inputs and positions. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Sierra Leone for their statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.
Final thoughts, and thank you for listening to Policy and Rights here on Depictions Media Radio, and I've been your host, Michael Clogs. It is the job of the United Nations to protect human rights, and to protect human rights from not only terrorists, but also governments who would act in ways against their citizens. Crimes, war crimes especially, where those who cannot defend themselves are attacked, civilians, women and children being raped and abused, is against what the United Nations stands for. And for them to come up with statements to support and back that idea up, to ensure that people know the foundation of the United Nations and what it is supposed to actually stand for, is an actual good thing. But we also need to remember some of the history behind the idea of raping and pillaging people in order to control them. The first time it actually ever shows up on a civilized basis would be with Sparta, where the Spartan warriors, as they conquered, they would rape the women. And matter of fact, it's stated in history that the Spartan warriors, the only way they knew how to have sex was with a woman was through rape. It shows up again in colonialism and how the Europeans took over North America. They did so by raping the women and tearing down a matriarch system to replace it with a patriarch system, where instead of having women have a strong say in how government and politics was supposed to happen, they tore it down for one that would eliminate women. Then in more modern times, that we would also see as in conflicts such as Vietnam and Korea, where the U.S. soldiers were reported to have raped villagers simply just because they could. We're going to say that most countries have learned a lesson that it is against humanity to do such things. That just because you have defeated their military doesn't give you the right to have your way with the civilians. We're going to say that we have ascended to a better way of dealing with civilians. Someone posted, especially when dealing with Gaza, they posted that the military should regard civilians as they would their own family members, and treat them with respect and dignity. Not just simply figure that, oh, this is a shooting gallery, let's kill them all. Let's keep some of this in mind and remind those who are in charge of militaries not to give orders, and to remind those who have sons and daughters that are in the military, to remind them to treat each and every person that they respect with respect, and if they're non-militant and or disarmed, to treat them especially with respect and care, so that we don't have to keep coming up with resolutions about what determines a war crime. Thank you for listening to Policy and Race here on Depictions Media Radio. Please find that subscribe button and give us some support if you come across our support page. This show has been produced by Depictions Media. Please contact us at depictions.media for more information.